All right. I'm super excited to be here with Layman Pascal. Layman and I have had a few conversations before, both on his channel and on mine specifically about Nietzsche. And today we're going to be talking about Hegel, who's a philosopher that's been an important part of my intellectual journey. I've already taught through Philosophy Portal a course on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, which is, to sum it up very quickly, a sort of his attempt at a science of experience. And actually, I'll be leading a course on the science of logic starting January 16th, 2022. And Layman will be actually a teacher in that course as well. So if you're interested in learning more about that course and what both I and Layman will be bringing to it, you can check a link in the description for more about the science of logic, and also just listen to this podcast, as hopefully it will be a window into some of the ideas we might want to dive into deeper and have more exploration of in 2023. How I want to start this conversation specifically about Hegel's Science of Logic and connecting it here in relationship to Layman Pascal's work on the metaphysics of adjacency. Layman wrote a great article on what he calls the metaphysics of adjacency, which I'll also leave a link in the description to, where he defines it as recognizing a post-metaphysical era, which is related to a widespread shift in the sense of truth. One way of thinking about this, as Layman writes it in the article, is it's a shift from what is, with a capital is, meaning here the absolute one, the essential unity, and fusion with that essential unity, to what is, a practical, pragmatic reality, and a emphasis on closeness as opposed to absolute fusion. This really interesting framing for Layman's work is something that made me think a lot about what Hegel wrote in the preface to his Science of Logic, where Hegel recognizes that the scientific era had killed metaphysics. And by metaphysics, he means the ultimate truth, the one. And he claimed that the twin forces of science and pragmatism had replaced metaphysics, but that was a mistake because, in a certain colloquial sense, Hegel thought man cannot live by science and pragmatism alone. His basic claim is that metaphysics is logic, and logic needed updating, and that logic had been left untouched by both science and pragmatism, that all that was left of logic was an empty form without any real psychic content. And so a lot of what the Science of Logic was about was to make logic alive again for the spiritual world, for our life world. And that required a type of science of logic that would open up a new conversation about science, pragmatism, and most importantly, the way we think about the truth. So here, connecting this back to Layman's metaphysics of adjacency, what I see as connecting these two is this widespread shift in the sense of truth and a difficulty to understand what is truth. How do we approach, and I guess in the more popular discourses we've been going through in the last 5 years, the type of recognition of a post-truth world. So in that sense, there's a lot on the line here, both for, people who are hyper interested in philosophy, people who are perhaps in a meta-modern or meta-spiritual community, but also for people at large. Of course, the truth affects all of us. So the first I'll welcome you here, Layman. And second, I'll sort of ask you, in the context of this framing, about how you understand post-metaphysics and also the paradox of post-metaphysics it's still kind of a metaphysics.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to be here with you again. Nice to be part of your course. Hegel is a tricky topic. It's kind of a thicket. There's a lot of ways in, and people draw a lot of different conclusions, and there are a lot of people who know Hegel much better than I do. But I think what I could say in general is, particularly in the Science of Logic, what it and the metaphysics of adjacency have in common is an appreciation of incompleteness as a coherent structural feature of the relationship between apparent alternatives and the use of that to rebuild philosophy and society in accordance with the implications of contemporary science and the assertions of a transcendental spirituality. So that's the kind of overview. When it comes to post-metaphysics, it's an inherently ambiguous phrase. It doesn't mean anti-metaphysics. It means a kind of metaphysics that takes a critical position after or in response to some other metaphysics. You could say that every metaphysical approach is post-metaphysical relative to the systems it hopes to supersede, saying, hey, some of the categories and entities that you assert are not real or misleading. So in the minimal sense, every paradigm shift is post-metaphysical to what came before it. When we get to what we might call postmodern culture, the pluralistic, the multi-perspectival, socio-critical thinking, aware of foreground, background transitions, and sensitive to marginalized categories, et cetera, that there's a post-culture that requires and implies a metaphysics that could be considered to be post-metaphysical in a stronger sense. The metaphysics of a world that is flexible and relativistic and not bound by any singular overriding self-consistent sense of a totalized one. And then you have attempts people have made to rebuild or refine a metaphysical system that could incorporate this relativistic cultural and intellectual mood. These are attempts to integrative thinking, meta theories in general. Hegel might be an example of this. All the sorts of things we could call trans-relativistic thinkers are, from one point of view, clarifying, deepening, and expanding the underlying assumptions of the multi-perspectival universe. So that's where I came into this. I was a participant years ago, invited in by Bruce Alderman to projects around integral post-metaphysical spirituality. The simplest form of that was, it's a project about spirituality as something you enact rather than something you have to believe in. But the whole time I was up against this question of what is the metaphysics presumed by a post-metaphysical worldview? So what do pluralistic and integrative and non-dual spiritual worlds, even if we think of them as primarily enacted and agnostic and inherently interpreted experiences, what underlying reality do they imply in order to operate? So that's what I named the metaphysics of adjacency, because I saw a basic conceptual thread implied by all these attempts. And that thread was essentially the affordances provided by intercontextual proximity. To be a pluralist or a post-pluralist or even a non-dualist, you have to have this experience and assumption of the ability to move between and affirm multiple reality tunnels, whether they be so far apart they can barely register each other, close enough to challenge each other, or so close it's basically impossible to tell them apart. The presumption of all those kinds of worlds is that there's an interspace that can handle and provide interactions and alternatives between fundamental types of perspectives. So to change our mind, to consider a left-out perspective, to build and integrate a worldview, all of those acts would be impossible unless your underlying presumption about reality was that perspectives and contexts have a space-like availability for interaction around and between them. And this space permits varying degrees of proximity. For some of those alternatives are so unrelated it makes virtually no difference to compare or contrast them, and some are so close we feel an intense need to decide between them. So I started to think about the various dynamics involved in a metaphysics of adjacency. What would it mean to situate concepts like next to or near or almost or approximately or sort of as being ontologically fundamental, more fundamental than the apparent options that they mediate between? And this has an interesting feature of fitting very well with an emergent cultural mood that comes from relaxed, complex thinkers who seem to find it necessary to say sort of about almost everything they encounter. Right? So what does fundamental reality look like in that sense? Relational, reciprocal, variable, gradient, interactive, field-like, basho, as the Kyoto school might say, non-absolute, except in its non-absoluteness, and generative at certain thresholds of proximity, and in between that's everywhere. So that's my initial sense of the metaphysics that underlies post-metaphysics. It's the implied assumptions that allow you to be post-metaphysical in some of the various ways that people like to be post-metaphysical.
Fantastic. And my first reaction to that is something I wanted to emphasize, not just on the level of sort of your personal propositional ideas in terms of, of, let's say, metaphysics of adjacency as a worldview, but in terms of how I've experienced you personally, how you've related to me since we've been relating in the last however many months or maybe up to a year, and also how I see you move in this larger space. In my view, does embody these ideas, in some sense, in specifically in the sense of you do a very good job, I think, of including people who might not necessarily fit well in certain categories or fit well within certain communities, but nonetheless, there's interesting links, there's interesting ideas to explore, and so my point here is that not only do I think you do a good job of explaining what a metaphysics of adjacency is. I think you also have done a good job of showing others through your actions what are the consequences of this metaphysics for moving in intellectual spaces, let's say. And maybe before I ask another question, I also maybe want to situate this view within sort of my relationship to the history of philosophy. I've got this triad. I haven't actually written a paper about this, but it's an idea which I think is worth writing a paper about. It's sort of a reflection of three major areas of philosophy, three major eras of philosophy: the ancient, the modern, and the postmodern, where you have figures like Plato, Hegel, and Deleuze. And Plato here represents the absolute one, the truth in another world, you could say the dualism of Platonic thinking. And that has a certain effect and consequence on the ideational structures of the ancient world. You move to someone like Hegel, and that one becomes, radically immanent and non-dual, in the sense that it's not a truth, a totalizing truth in another world, but actually involves the historical movement of spirit. And that obviously reflects, a lot of how we think about the cognitive structures of the modern world. Then you come to someone like Deleuze, and what you get is much more an affirmation, not on a one, but on a many ones. And you get an emphasis on a multiplicity, a plurality, an affirmation of all that plurality and all that, and that represents sort of the postmodern experience of reality. So I feel like, in some sense, the metaphysics of adjacency engages with this long history of philosophy and the way in which our worlds are becoming in need of new levels of inclusion of multiplicity, new levels of inclusion of affirmation of different points of views. Of course, difference is an essential category for Deleuze as well. So when you think about here the base of your metaphysics, in terms of how I've heard you describe it, as kind of like a variable intensity relational space. It could be that the variable intensity relational space in the ancient world, or even in the modern world, was not in need of intense philosophical reflection, but it could be that that's becoming more and more important. So when you think about the metaphysics of adjacency, and specifically starting with this variable intensity relational space, could you unpack how this influences your philosophical development and just how you think in general?
I think when we look at the ancients, we see a variety of different opinions, right? That as everybody from Nietzsche onward has pointed out, the tradition that might come down from Heraclitus looks a little bit different than the tradition that comes down from Plato and Socrates and so on. So there have been thinkers in the ancient world that have focused a little bit more on the dialectical interactions between things that I would suggest imply the kind of adjacency that I'm talking about. You see it in Taoism, you see it in the Nagarjuna, right? And I think you see it in Hegel, as well as you see it in things like integral theory and quantum mechanics and Deleuze as well. What they typically didn't do, the ancients were very pragmatic in a way, right? They tended to think of things in a kind of colloquial fashion. It wasn't actually very important for them most of the time to clarify the fundamental accuracy of what things were. They just had to clarify, how do we interact with this thing? So they tended to think in terms of single, solid, organized objects. And then if they got a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more complex, they would think in terms of some kind of dynamic relationship between opposites. What they normally didn't bring to the surface was, what's the underlying assumption of a vision that allows the interaction between opposites to occur, right? There has to be some space in which things can be connected without being the same. That's the fundamental underlying assumption of an oppositional view, whether you're thinking of the masculine and the feminine, or the yin and the yang, or contingency and necessity. All of these things, in order to be compared or contrasted, in order to be treated as a broken dualism or as a functional, dynamic, interlocked, paradoxical dualism, in all of those cases, there's the same underlying assumption about the ontology that's not inspected. If today we wish to inspect that so that we could bring a higher degree of accuracy to our calculations, then we need to bring that forward and also say why it was necessary at each of those previous phases. So for me, I think there's a huge field of things like quantum mechanics that have made explicit progress by bringing this underlying assumption into the foreground. And we would want to be able to do that across the different domains of our knowledge acquisition, and also in a way that connects with, for me personally, what I think are the ethical, behavioral, relational, and spiritual implications, which is a way of being with each other that's non-dogmatic and non-separative. It's a way of maintaining a certain kind of flexible dynamic interaction, in that sort of Buckminster Fuller tensegrity sense, and a way of appreciating that everything is relational and everything is open, and that there are thresholds within that reciprocal opening space that allow the activation of new functions. And a super simple way to think about that is the way they teach people to do chi work. Right? You go, your hands are too far apart. They can't sense each other. They don't start you like this. They have you bring your hands into a distance where they start to get activated by each other. And that's where you do your training, is in that special distance. And I think we could be thinking about special interactive threshold distances as a fundamental ontological category that has these direct correlations to spiritual, social, intellectual, philosophical, and scientific practical knowledge domains.
Right. I think it would be interesting to go into the space of or the nature of these special distances, specifically as it relates to this emphasis on proximity over fusion, because the big oppositional determination, as I experience it, and I suppose as I try to think it as well, is special distances are hard to cultivate, and that most people either especially when it relates, and here I'm thinking as it relates to intimate relationships of all kinds, intimate relationships of the family, intimate relationships of sexuality, or intimate partnerships, even friends, colleagues, coworkers, and so forth, is that either we have if something difficult comes up, either we have an absolute separation or a desire for an absolute collapse into each other. And, cultivating those special distances takes a different, perhaps, sensibility or way of perceiving the one and the other. Maybe if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, we could call this a tantric disposition if we wanted to. There's certainly something about relationships that is lived, and the way we live it is either successful or unsuccessful, but it's usually met with a totalizing or catastrophic form of thinking that is insufficient to what we actually do. So one of the reasons we always point to the insufficiency of the left brain mode to describe the dynamic, complex processes of the right brain holistic world is that it tends to break down into we're separate or we're unified. We have these two goals, which are sort of hasty. They come out of, that Reichian armoring. They come out of a clumsy attempt to just simply grasp or simply reject. And when that's reflected at the level of our thoughts, it becomes very intense, but it also becomes insufficient. It lacks accuracy. So, like, if you're with a lover, the simple way to think about this is you might say, I want to be united with you. I want to be fused. I want to be one with you. But you don't actually want that, right? You don't want your pancreases to occupy the same space. You don't want total unification. What you want is an increase of proximity to the point where an additional function is generated, right? You want to be so close it becomes as if it were something else. And if you talk to people who do sort of sex education, neo-tantra and things like that, one of the things they're instructing people to do a lot of the time is to be very sensitive to these different threshold distances, right? There's all kinds of things you can learn at each of these thresholds if you're attentive to them. So that's one sexualized example of how we think about trying to find the right distance, trying to think in a clearer way by assuming that the goal we are after, the energy, the process, the transformation we want comes from that particular distance we're trying to find. And if we think about it as an all or nothing proposition of we're separate or we're together, that's too clumsy to be able to grasp that difference properly.
Yeah, and I think it's extremely interesting to think in this way in the context of what perhaps has its epicenter in North American culture wars, but certainly has its ripple effect around the world. That is sort of the underlying tensions which make, for example, woke or anti-woke a thing at all. When you think about, for example, you brought up in your Metaphysics of Adjacency paper, which again, I'll link below, the need to, for example, include previously marginalized background communities like, I think you name women, people of color, all these different categories. And when we think about tensions that are generated within so-called woke or anti-woke culture, I think a lot of the time these tensions are being produced by the lack of special distance spaces, let's say, to have difficult conversations about what it means to be fully inclusive or something like that. So I think this way of thinking, and oftentimes we do get literally fusion mentalities, or we get totally separatist mentalities when it comes to, when we get to the extreme edges of these culture war discussions. So what do you think about the application of this way of thinking to things like the culture wars? You might give other examples.
Yeah, I think we see all kinds of different interpersonal and social dimensions in which what we actually need is to more intelligently negotiate the appropriate distance in any given context, rather than to think in terms of identity or separation from identities. The opposite example of the sexual intimacy example is when two people are in some kind of extreme emotional clash, right? And one person will make that's it, I'm done with you. We have nothing more in common. I'm done. I'm leaving this relationship, and they storm out. And then they come back 20 minutes later. They just needed to get some air, go for a drive, whatever it was, right? So there's what they actually needed was to adjust relative to the context, the proximity. That's the underlying structural dimension of it. And what they instead did from the mental dimension was go into these extreme catastrophic identity examples. And we see that all over in the political domain, right? I mean, it's very simple to go to that classic with us or against us kind of binary mentality. And the problem with the with us or against us binary mentality is not that there's a polarization between what's included and affirmed and what's excluded and critiqued. The problem is it seems like a simple switch rather than some kind of flexible gradient that's modified for particular circumstances to produce more or less optimal results. And I think we see that in, physics. We see that in the material world, the philosophical world, the political world, that the solutions we need come from undermining the sense of a switch back and forth between this or that identity category into a more nuanced gradient of some kind. Not everyone has to be included all the time, but essentially, from a bigger point of view, everybody is in relationship, and you have to figure out what those distances are for any given situation.
Right. And I think that connects really well to another sort of, I think, important dimension of what you call the metaphysics of adjacency as it relates to the category, and correct me if I'm wrong in pronouncing this, but metaphemes. Metaphemes?
Yeah, metapheme is a word I came up with to describe what's been called vision logic structures in some integral thinking. It's a stable pattern of active adjacency. So a metapheme shows up typically where two variables cannot be defined apart from each other. Yeah. Philosophically, that could look like contingency and necessity, as it does in Hegel. It might look like subjectivity and objectivity. Physically, it could look like space-time or the indeterminacy between position and momentum. What happens is the discovery in any field of knowledge, the two conventionally opposed or conventionally unrelated patterns of information cannot be articulated more precisely without each one articulating the other across some kind of gap. So there turns out to be an apparent, this very Hegelian in Science of Logic, there turns out to be an apparent insufficiency within the self-definition of things and ideas and selves. But it's not exactly an insufficiency. It's a flexible gap that orients toward a seemingly external other thing, idea, or self, which in turn is having the same problem. And the gap is precise. This is why it can become a science. It defines how close together two ideas have to be in order to operate at a deeper level of precision. So in quantum theory, position and momentum are part of a shared definition that works at a specific difference, a fraction of a Planck unit away from each other in terms of their definition. There's an exact degree of adjacency between these seemingly alternative physical facts, which allows, as long as we don't collapse it by saying they're the same or they're uncorrelated, as long as we preserve the appropriate distance of mutual approximation, we get scientific results more precise than did our ancestors. So this is very close to Hegel's attempt to formulate a trans-oppositional scientific logic that exceeds conventional thinking, but avoids the trap of mere critique. It builds in a dialectic, but supersedes the dialectic in a new speculative fact that can take philosophy and science and society to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that you're connecting this here with quantum mechanics, because one of the things that impresses itself on my consciousness so strongly as I'm building out the Science of Logic course is just how it seems like Hegel's logic moves in a quantum way, and it's interesting here to open up the conversation, as I think Slavoj Žižek does a good job of insofar as how helpful Hegel might be for thinking the philosophical foundations of quantum mechanics. But I think you define here the metaphemes as units of analysis that resemble paradoxes. And in terms of thinking about metaphemes as paradoxes and thinking about reality as paradoxical, one of the things that I always was, and this will lead into a question, but one of the things I was always sort of wrestling with during my doctorate was the way in which it seemed like the conventional scientific attitude thought of paradox as something to be resolved, as opposed to something more fundamental that needed to be worked with as such, that that paradox was a feature, not a bug, sort of thing, which is, I think, something we've already alluded to in another way. But how would you relate to paradox within a metaphysics of adjacency?
Yeah, one of the ways we could do Hegel's 3 moments of thought is to think about it in terms of ordinary life where people don't deal with paradoxes. Things just are what they are. and then a more sophisticated dialectical interrogation of ordinary thinking, which points out that there are paradoxes all over the place. Socrates is constantly pointing out logical flaws or implicit paradoxes in the local Athenians that he's dealing with. Now, it seems like from that middle range, and you get this a lot in contemporary academic, scientific, mathematical, social theory, that the paradox is somehow a limitation on our knowingness, right? So the paradox either tells us about an implicit limit that we can't get beyond, or it presents a puzzle that we have to resolve in order to get rid of that structure. And yet, there are structures we know about that have the paradoxical form, which are not dysfunctions or limitations, right? The Mobius strip is a perfect example of a paradox-like structure that defines a functional, self-consistent operation. And the question would then be, how many kinds of things in existence actually have a functional structure of that kind when viewed from a larger multi-perspectival vision? Right? It could be, I've proposed this, that all boundary conditions are in fact Mobius-like in their function. And until you've found the thing that looks paradoxical, you haven't actually found the structure of how a thing operates. And sometimes people have found something like that and interpreted it as a limitation on knowing, when in fact it's an opening up to a richer kind of knowing. We see this in the quantum domain, which is a lot of people really naively feel like Einstein's relativity and Heisenberg's indeterminacy or uncertainty points to the fact that our ability to know the world is fundamentally limited. We used to think we could know it, and now it's been proven that there's a limit because we run into a paradox shape. But actually, relativity theory and indeterminacy have allowed us to make more accurate predictions than any of our ancestors. It's massively increased the consistency, coherence, and certainty of our ability to operate pragmatically in the world, because it's taken these seeming paradoxical structures and, instead of viewing them as a limit condition, have viewed them as the fundamental forms of a new kind of knowledge. But you have to be able to cognitively track a certain kind of simultaneous multi-perspectival interaction, and emotionally you have to be able to put up with the sensations that are produced in us by paradoxical experience. But if you can handle both of those, things that have the shape of paradox are actually an opening to a new kind of knowledge rather than a failure of the old kind of knowledge. This is very Hegelian in the sense that the thing that seems like it thwarts our knowing is in fact the key to a more enhanced knowing.
Yeah, exactly. And I, in my own, that's an interesting, again, I like the way you're connecting it to relativity and quantum mechanics. And I've often had the assumption, I suppose, that one of the biggest roadblocks, or one of the biggest, obstacles, I suppose, to not intellectually communicating this information is related to the emotional sensitivity required to take this on board as a way of being. It does require a different level of emotional sensitivity. But I'm sort of tempted to give an example of how this Mobius-like strip structure is related to boundary conditions, and that might also be interesting to think about in relationship to the absolute, or the way in which people think in terms of absolutes. It's well, I'll give the example first. It's that there's this Republican convention. I remember watching this political talk show where they were talking about a Republican convention in somewhere in Florida, and this dating app Grindr, which is for homosexual relations, spiked in its user rate at the center of the Republican convention, which was specifically focused on, at the time, banning gay marriage. So there is this weird paradox where the people who were dead focused on banning gay marriage were at the same time being motivated unconsciously to use this Grindr dating app where they're going to hook up and so forth with other, of course, repressed homosexuality. And again, just making this point that repressed homosexuality, especially in certain cultural context, is connected to that desire inside yourself. So again, this other side of the Mobius loop, where on one side of the Mobius loop, you have a sort of professional identity, which is against gay marriage. On the other side of the Mobius loop, you have the desire to have homosexual relations. And so this paradox emerges. And I'm not using that example specifically for political motives like being anti-Republican or something like that, but just saying that absolute identities as such might have this weird twist in them, where what it looks like on one side is the opposite on the other side. And there's lots of examples like this, but I wanted to ask you specifically in this context about adjacency being non-totalizable, and that it improves, you say, a way of conceiving absolutes. And I think that, like, the way well, first I'll just ask, what do you mean by this in relationship to paradox and stuff like that? You have these absolute paradoxes.
Yeah, they're actually relative paradoxes, and they adjust as we go. I joke in the Metaphysics of Adjacency that 99 is the new 100%, which is a way to remember to think without totalization. If you were to remove 0 and 100% from your reasoning process, then what does that look like? That's a good way into thinking in adjacency terms. So you're always dealing with degrees of approximation that are never absolute. They're never, because an absolute is a kind of cutoff. It ceases to be relational. It ceases to be alive. It's either completely this or it's none of that. And there's actually no thinkable conditions that obey those constraints. Right? One of the interesting examples is if you think about the question of whether the universe begins in order or begins in chaos. That's an interesting provocation to consider, but you can't actually decide either way. Because if you were to reduce the amount of order to the point where you had a universe initially consisting only of chaos, it still would not consist only of chaos, because it obeys a minimal ordering constraint, which is that it's all chaos and not order. It has that specific orderly homogeneity that characterizes it. So you would not be able to remove all order from the early conditions of the universe or any situation. You could radically minimize it, but you could never remove it, because order and chaos aren't definable apart from each other. It's fundamentally a metapheme. It's a single concept that has to be viewed in this sort of Mobius-like shape. And so as a result, anywhere within the system that obeys that Mobius-like constraint is never a point where it's absolutely something or absolutely not something else. It's always some degree of that. So there's a number of different ways that thinkers in the last 100 or 200 years have criticized basic identity structures, challenges to the equalsness of the equal sign, so to speak. Do 1 and 1 really perfectly make 2, or is there still some slight difference? That's a really interesting set of critiques. And in a way, for me, it goes along with a shift from algebra to computation, where instead of just looking at an equation as a symmetry on a chalkboard that's held in stasis, we're thinking of those things as representations of a computational dynamic process in which you start at a 1 position and you add a 1 to it and you end up at a 2 position. But the resultant position is not identical to the first position. It's the result of a process. But the fact that it's a result makes it distinct from the first one. So there's a little bit of, let's say, inaccuracy. There's a little bit of non-identity that's possible even between 1 + 1 = 2. The 1 and the 1 are even visually distinct from the 2. We can say that they functionally have some kind of shared identity, but that shared identity is imperfect. It approximates a perfection, right? And so the thing we need to do is understand that we can separate the functional power and the certainty feeling that we hitherto attributed to absolutes. We can separate that from the concept of the absolute. We don't need to think of completely absent or completely present, completely separate or completely unified in order to get the thing that we were using those concepts to get for us. So a great example of that is the way that Leibniz really emphasized the infinitesimal, right? Which is to say, you have something that's indefinitely receding toward a vanishing point. And you can use that thing as if it were a complete whole integer of some kind. You can use it functionally. It can guarantee you the operational and felt certainty that you need in order to operate. But that doesn't mean that it is that unity, because it never reaches it, right? The infinitesimal, like the digits of pi, it never reaches its end state. There is no end state. It's an endless sequence of approximations. But you can use endless approximation to operate as if it were a whole thing. We just have to remember that the reason it can do that is because it doesn't actually ever achieve its completion state. There's no achieved completion states. There's no necessary absolutes. And that's a difficult thing initially to grasp until you can source the functionality and the feeling we used to get from absolutes to something like a special threshold within the indeterminacy adjacency relational space.
So much to say there. In regards to sort of saying the absolute, the difference between the absolute paradox and the relativistic paradox, I suppose what I was trying to get at is that it's experienced intuitively as an absolute paradox, but then logically it's a relativistic paradox, and you have to make that's the emotional sensitivity dimension, I suppose, and also how you ended there, sourcing the functional feelings or sourcing the functional intuition of that experience towards a more logical way of interpreting it. And so many interesting things you said there actually represent an interesting way to connect this to Hegel's Science of Logic, specifically the metapheme as this analysis of a single paradoxical concept. And the example you were giving as order and chaos at the beginning of the universe, Hegel actually makes that same critique of Kant and his categories in regards to, Kant saying that when we get to the beginning of the universe, order and chaos, we're left with these fundamental contradictions. And he said, no, we have to think about it from the perspective of the concept as such, the paradox of the concept as such. And then also Hegel even uses the example you gave about algebra to computation in terms of the difference between thinking about static identities to computational dynamics, where the result is non-identical to the beginning, the origin of the process. So it's just really interesting to think about all of these things and like the practical consequences they have for the way we think about the underlying philosophy of mathematics or the underlying philosophy of the concepts of the beginning of time, and what does that even mean. I think these are the types of things that we want to think about more in the course itself. I think the next logical, and even there are other things that I can connect that to a question though. So this way you emphasize this endless approximation of never achieving completion, and that it requires a sort of perspectival shift on the end state, basically, so that you can use the whole process. I think this comes up in Hegel's Science of Logic as well, specifically as it relates to the what he calls bad infinity and true infinity, where bad infinity is this endless approximation and true infinity is sort of conceptualizing it from the point of the whole process. How do you make sense of the emotional dimension that's involved in, this endless approximation where you think you're going to get to the end, and the perspectival shift on this dynamic?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to come at that emotional question. One is, can you tell yourself a story that explains why you can get the things you need from approximation that you used to think you needed to get from absolutes, right? And that's sort of what I just laid out over the last few minutes, which is if 99 is the new 100%, then everything we meant by 100% was actually provided by 99%, which is the symbol of an appropriate threshold, whatever that is. So you can tell yourself a story where it's emotionally acceptable because all the things you needed from 100% or zero, from identity or non-identity as fundamental opposites, you can get all of that stuff through the approximation process. So part of it is telling yourself, is a narrative that redescribes metaphysics in a way that guarantees you can get the things you need from it, even though we move into this flexible model of truth as a relationship. The other part of it is more psychophysiological. Is your body, is your muscle armoring, is your self-regulation fluid enough, flexible enough to operate in that space, right? We see this come up in every kind of therapeutic dynamics, which is when you're facing a situation in life, a situation with another person, a situation with an issue, are you capable of relaxing to the degree you would need to relax in order to function well with that person, that issue, that object, in a way that doesn't foreclose your ability to handle it in a nuanced fashion? I think Chogyam Trungpa said this thing about how do you ride a horse well? You hold on tight, but not too tight. That's true of everything. That's true of things physically, relationally, cognitively. We need to be able to continually enter into a space emotionally where we are adjusting to try to find that, what John Vervaeke calls the optimal grip. You're looking for the utility of a dynamic threshold in that in-between space. And that's something you can emotionally allow yourself to do, but it takes a risk, right? There's a feeling that you're going to lose what you would get by the grasping, clinging, craving, armored hold that you might otherwise have on the completeness or the renunciation of something. You have to be able to undergo the risk, which is as much physiological as it is emotional, of letting go of your over grasp. But the beauty of that is it facilitates the emergence of a new skill set that's better able to handle the nuances which are necessary in order to develop expertise in any particular domain.
Yeah, that's it's a nice metaphor here. The grip, and also the example you gave about riding a horse. You want to hold on tight, but not too tight. There's a metaphor that Michelle Garner of OG Rose uses about who owns a bird: the person who grabs the bird from the legs, or the person who the bird's sitting in their open palm. And of course, the person with the open palm, the bird can just fly away or come back or not come back. But the person who's holding the bird here, the bird can't fly away, but at the same time wants to fly away. And I think that that's a really interesting way to think about relationship dynamics, other things.
And I would just add to that's like, there's a way to do it very simply, which is to suggest that the risk of the open palm is the move.
Yeah.
And that's not always the right move, but that risk has to be undergone, because in reality, we're looking at a flexible variation of moves that go from gripping very firmly to barely gripping at all. And it has to be constantly adjusted in that space, because the bird will be changing and you will be changing and the circumstance will be changing. And if you take that flexible gradient of moves and you were to say situated inside the essence of an equals sign, then you'd have something close to the metaphysics of adjacency.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And there's some paradoxes with the completely open palm, and just here thinking about, again, bringing it back to, I think what the metaphor points to is, this, related to what we talked about, this desire to be close and the desire to hold, but you don't want to hold too tightly. And maybe here, the metaphor of how to ride a horse well is a little bit better. But you want to be close without suffocating. You want to hold tight, but be able to let the other person breathe, and all of this nuanced space that you're speaking to, I think, requires that emergence of a new skill set. Is that something that you have taught or been teaching, or supposedly cultivated in oneself?
I work on it as part of everything that I do. So when I do spiritual or physical or intellectual work, either on myself or with people, that I'm trying to subfuse it within that general approach. And partly because that's simply what works with people in order to guarantee the maximum amount of multidimensional exchange that's mutually empowering to people. Because when you drop that, when you're no longer attentive to that flexible gradient, then you suddenly start acting from a position where you're trying to absolutely impart your wisdom to someone else and have them duplicate you, or there's somehow a fool that is sundered from the operation that you're undergoing. So at any situation in which you take the other seriously and respect the other in a dynamic relationship is a situation in which you're embodying something that the metaphysics of adjacency would have to describe. So, partly there's conscious teaching of it, but partly it's simply the fact that if you're not doing that, then you're going to end up failing to have a good time with other human beings.
Right. Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial. And it seems to be related to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is this minimal level of otherness. That it seems like when we want like in the example you just gave of the other as a fool or the other as completely duplicable, it's we could approach it in many other ways as well. But it seems like in the example of where the other becomes completely duplicable, you want this fusion into oneness, and when the other is a fool, you want this complete separation or complete distance. But there is a way in which to interact with other humans well and to cultivate long-term relationships. I think there is this necessity of including within oneself minimal otherness. So what do you think about this?
Well, I think it's true, and there's a lot of different ways to approach it, right? You could approach it from the angle of developmental psychological structure, right? And we could speculate that, as many people have, that in order to detect the experience of the self, you're sort of running that through a loop of encountering the other first, right? You learn the experience of the self as the self is for another, so that even as you grow and develop a lot of substantial individuality, there's still this residual of the ability to turn on yourself as if the other was present, which you learn from developing within the context of the other. So the other is always there, at least as a virtual trace, right? And then there are all the elements in which we say, we gain all of our language came from somebody else. So even when I use it as my terminology, the other is present there in the core attempts by me to language myself. It's also someone else's language. And then those are very psychologically practical, sociologically practical. In a more spiritual sense, we open up to the transcendental dimension that's afforded by relational dynamics, the thing that the sort of masculine and feminine togetherness of Tantra is meant to symbolically evoke for us, is the sense, or even the Christian notion of love, that the fundamental spiritualized ontological condition is relational. It's not an isolated condition. And to fuse completely with the other would also be an isolated condition, because the other would vanish as soon as your identity was completely fused with it. So what you actually have, and what's actually proposed by most of the great mystical traditions, is to increase your capacity to occupy and refine and then radiate some kind of relational dynamic. But there is no relational dynamic unless there's some sort of experiential connection between the self and some kind of other, right? You can't remove that. If you remove that, all you get is a dysfunctional situation. It doesn't matter whether you remove that by trying to completely separate or whether you remove that by trying to completely fuse. In both those cases, you lose all of the intelligence and all of the feeling flavor that comes along with deepening into the relational dynamic of reality.
I mean, when I think about a lot of what is said about our very strange modern social life, which I don't think can be thought in the abstract separate from the new technological digital environment that we're in, and the emergence and the proliferation and ubiquity of the internet, is that there is this sort of idea that at least part of the mental health crisis is this collapse into separation, like that we all feel like we're well, there's a paradox of like we're all connected by the internet, but we're all becoming more separate, and we're all becoming more isolated, and large scale social groupings are becoming more difficult. What do you think about the way we can cultivate this minimal level of otherness in our current techno-social landscape?
I think remembering that it's the implication of the position we find ourselves in is a useful thought to have, right? Adjacency is a very apt way to think about the metaphysics of the world in a network age, because interlinking is the underlying techno-economic structure that's running our societies now. And even though you're isolated, even though you're sitting there just on your phone in your own hunched little world, you still are objectively dependent upon the incoming sources of the information, the other to whom you are reacting, the other who is the source of your entertainment, the other who has built the device. So there's a sense in which you are performatively enacting a relationship to the other. And you might physiologically, mentally, and emotionally be withdrawing from the fact of that interaction. So one thing to remember is, through observation and insight, to constantly teach ourselves that where we feel separate, we are actually in some kind of connection. Like I literally can't separate from something that I'm not connected to. That's the precondition of my separative gesture. Sometimes I say the separator is the connector. If I put up a fence between us, that fence now connects us in some way. It's something we share. So I actually can't get myself out of the relational condition under which I would negotiate proximity. And if I can remember that situation, then I have a better chance of thriving as a human being under the conditions that are suggested to us by our economic and technological situation. But we can actually expand that a little bit more, because there are different dimensions of otherness that might come into play. Would lean more towards the spiritual work that I do. Your own body might seem like it's an other to you, right? It's one of those things where the simplest way to help mitigate against over-investment compulsively in digital interfaces is to remember the sensation of the whole of the body, right? It's an ancient classic spiritual developmental technique to re-engage your nervous system with proprioceptive, somatic, interoceptive intensities. When you remember that your body is here, then you're actually here. And suddenly you're regulating your heartbeat differently. You take a different breath. You have some kind of flexible distance reestablished between you and the interface device. But that was predicated upon you remembering that there is some other feature of yourself that you're not including. And you could, as I've done, analyze spiritual practice as a whole set of ways in which we experience the self-otherness within ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's extremely important. And I love the logic. Again, I think it's an interesting paradoxical logic of the separator is the connector. I think that's, it resonates very strongly in me personally when I think about the way desire for separation requires a connection, and just the paradoxes involved in those relational dynamics are, I think, more common than many people presuppose. And that brings us, I think, to the topic of boundaries. I think that when it comes to like you mentioned, sort of a for separation is also the way in which two people are connected. And of course, a fence is a static boundary, but you emphasize a lot in the Metaphysics of Adjacency the importance of thinking of boundaries as actually fuzzy, empty fields, permeable thresholds, spaces of constant negotiation. So, for example, if there's a fence separating two people, or you put up a fence separating you from the other, that is actually the result of a space of negotiation, that space came to be through certain mediation of a self-other boundary. So how do you think this way of thinking about boundaries is useful here, or insightful?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that it would be intriguing to think about all boundaries as having more like a Mobius shape. Another way to think about it is in that field sense. It's very famously, if you zoom in on two things that are physically in contact closely enough with a microscope, you'll discover they're not touching. What you're looking at is entangled electromagnetic fields that don't quite make direct contact, and that there's a little bit of variability in there. And that sense that the contact points whether those are contact points that strike us as positive, or whether those are contact points where we're trying to put up a defensive boundary of some kind. Nonetheless, it's more like a field of spatial opportunities in which we have to negotiate. Partly because everything's moving, and you have to, if you made a perfect boundary and everything else is shifting, then 5 minutes from now that boundary is no longer perfect. It's like if you put something, I mean, the continents themselves are shifting, so to speak, right? The underlying structure of the world is dynamic and in motion, so you can't hold a fixed boundary, even if you wanted it to perform just an absolute boundary condition. You would have to constantly feel out where its new position is, because everything that it's in relationship to is shifting. And now this becomes very practical in terms of things like personal boundaries. Where you can't know it in advance, right? You could make only a hypothesis, only a speculative suggestion about where the boundary is. In order to actually find it, you would need to experientially overshoot it and retract multiple times. You'd have to negotiate back and forth to find out where at the moment your boundary currently is. And what that suggests is the presumed idea behind that is a space in which that boundary exploration flexibility is necessary. And you can't find an actual boundary unless you're able to move back and forth in a region of potential boundaries. You're looking for an activating threshold that is currently appropriate within that space. But unless you could do that, unless you have that flexibility, the boundary itself will fail. So the boundaries are alternatively and simultaneously ways of connecting and ways of dissociating, which should be understood to be versions of the same phenomenon. Connective dissociation is all we encounter in a non-dual sense in the world. All separations are connections and vice versa. But how you deal with that practically is you need to be able to negotiate back and forth around the boundary, that the boundary itself is an opportunity afforded by that negotiative space.
I mean, I'm tempted here to ask a question about perhaps the formal nature of the institution. I have this feeling like the institution today, perhaps it's a symptom of the meaning crisis, perhaps it's related to the emergence of online digital technologies. Just even what we're doing right now would not have been possible in, for example, the 90s or something like that. But that a lot of the implicit boundaries of the institutional structures of our world are in need of new negotiation, new open conversations, new ideas about what's inside, what's outside, what does it mean to constitute an inside versus an outside. So how does the metaphysics of adjacency view, or how do you view the contemporary institutional landscape from the perspective of the metaphysics of adjacency?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to go at that. I mean, one of the things when we look at institutions today, we find that some are reasonably functional, but a lot of them have become deficient. And how you would discover the new form that they should take, we might say that it has to be more complex, more inclusive, more organic, or whatever kinds of adjectives we want to throw at that. We nonetheless have to be able to take the existing structures, do something to them that shows us where the boundary conditions should currently be, and then try to instantiate those, knowing that they will change going forward. And the way we get that information about where the boundaries should be now as opposed to where they previously were is we need individuals to transgress those boundaries without breaking those boundaries. Right, you have to have agents, you have to have information streams that move back and forth across where the boundary was, negotiating in that space in order to figure out where it's applying, where it's not applying, and in order to trace out where the new contemporary boundaries ought to be. So that's one thing in terms of setting up the form of institutions. But there's also implications in other areas where we might think, how do we make collective decisions together, right? Have we correctly negotiated the informational boundaries between the opinions of individuals when we try to put them together into a collective decision? The proposal made by the advocates of democracy is, here's a more intelligent way to have people be both simultaneously collective and simultaneously autonomous. The previous systems or simpler systems might have symbolically, one person being autonomous and everyone else being collectively subjugated. The democratic idea is to adjust that. And if we start to see things in those terms, we can look forward in institutions to other ways to make a similar adjustment. If you and I wanted to come institutionally to a collective decision, how would we go about doing that? We need to think about new ways to be simultaneously the same and different with each other. How do we produce a collective intelligence, an implementable shared decision that's smarter than both of us without sacrificing either of our individual perspectives on the subject? One of the problems we get with simple majority democracy is it ends up eliminating a lot of the information from a lot of the population. If 40% of the people vote and 51% of those elect a certain party, there's no way in which that party represents the community in general. Most of the information from the other individuals has been lost by what's now being presupposed to be the collective decision. So I'm just pointing to the fact that there's an enormous range of ways we could think about using the interactions between apparently separative and apparently conjoined entities, negotiating in between that space to try to work out new ways and new formalities for coming to collective decisions together. Because I think that's the driver underneath a lot of our institutions. If we have institutions that seem very advanced, even very contemporary, and they make decisions in the old-fashioned way, then we're probably going to get a lot of bad results. And if you have things that are more amorphous, they don't even quite look like institutions, but they're able to make decisions in a smarter way, a way that doesn't sacrifice autonomy to get communion or vice versa, then we've got something we might be able to get behind. But the key there is to be able to increase autonomy and communion without sacrificing one for the other. And then that's sort of an instantiation of this fundamental idea that you can't choose between one or the other on that front. You're never going to be able to opt for liberty and autonomy against communion or vice versa. As soon as you have that thought, as soon as you have the emotion that goes with that thought, then the strategy you're going to produce is not going to work with reality, because reality is an ultimately entangled, flexible situation between those apparent opposites.
I've always been kind of sympathetic to the idea that one of the most salient features of not postmodernism as an ideology, but I rather think the postmodern condition is the way in which the transgressive becomes the norm. Like that you include transgression to such a degree that the old boundaries completely fall away, but then that transgressive act becomes its own norm. I saw that and I experienced that paradoxically when I was doing some sort of, I suppose, quasi-anthropological investigations with anarchist communities, where the anarchists would totally transgress the norms of the normative society, but then they would have their own weird norms inside their own total transgression. They would just reproduce sort of dynamics and structures that you would see that they were against, on the inside. But there's this way in which, again, there has to be a more fluid relationship between the dynamic of transgression and the dynamic of forming boundaries. And I think I can relate to this personally a little bit, because in some sense, what I'm trying to create with Philosophy Portal, okay, I'm creating a course on Hegel Science of Logic. You might think about that as something that would be formally integrated into the institutions of academia, but in some sense, I've tried to transgress those boundaries and tried to reassert new boundaries in my own way. And I think what's interesting for me here is to think about, I'm not alone in doing things like this. I know other people who are doing little digital startups related to, people have called me extra academic or post-academic or something like that. What's the relationship here between the institutional dynamics within academia and these sort of weird online spaces? I mean, you're doing online courses as well. So, I think it's interesting to think about what is the dynamic in these spaces. Maybe I'll ask you before going into the next question, or the next scheduled question I have, what do you think about that reflection there?
I think it's a subset of the general idea that vitality occurs in borderland conditions, right? And there's lots of different kinds of borders. Some of those intermediary conditions could appear to be within the heart of academia, but generally speaking, we think of them as being at the edges of things. Just like in the, whether it's true or not, we've collectively had this fantasy that maybe life evolved on the beaches in sort of the interstitial condition where the land and the sea were creating overlapping, blurred conditions for new things to arise. That's certainly how the symbolic sexual process occurs, is that somewhere in the space between the masculinized and femininized, you get the production of new energy or the production of a new being of some kind. So I would expect, just on the face of things, that the intermediary, the trans-academic condition, would be the condition under which the new forms of academy, the new forms of intelligence are being generated. Something that is not wholly trapped within the form, nor wholly dissociated from the form. And I think it has a higher chance of being able to do that well and at the leading edge if these efforts understand themselves to be in a position that cannot be wholly separated or wholly immersed in the structural form of the academy. So my sense is that what you're doing, what we're doing, what a lot of people are doing, and what all the great thinkers have done more or less throughout history is trying to operate in that edge zone, because that's where the flow state learning is. That's the proximal sweet spot.
Right. Makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that leads really well into this topic, which I think is perhaps particularly interesting or particularly important for you, is the dimension of spiritual practice. Spiritual practice comes a lot up in, I think, your teachings and your courses and your general presence. And in regards to spiritual practice, you make this distinction between, and we've touched on it already a little bit, but this distinction between armored absolutistic boundaries versus liberating relational spaces of undoing reactive boundaries. I mean, the question, or the meme I want to throw at you here for reflection and maybe some, interesting thought is, I came across this meme in that was representing the relationship between spirituality and religion. And the meme was a fish in a goldfish bowl. And the goldfish bowl was in an ocean. And it said the goldfish bowl was religion and the ocean was spirituality. And it showed the fish jumping out of the goldfish bowl into the ocean. Out of the let's say the armored boundary of religion into the liberating open space of spirituality. But I think there's a paradox of this meme, which is that as soon as you jump out of the goldfish bowl, the fish might get eaten by a shark or something like that. So I'm just saying here that there's some interesting relationship between the need for boundaries and the need for liberation from those boundaries. What do you think about this distinction?
Yeah, that's a fun meme. It's probably not how I would define religion necessarily, but I think there is a very important sweet spot between having and releasing boundaries, right? One of the things we want to do is challenge our boundaries, challenge our ego, challenge our reactive patterns, but we don't want to lose our ability to be a good container. And it's the same in spirituality as it would be in exercise. If you become over-condensed and non-mobile, non-flexible, then your system can't operate well. The organs can't communicate. They don't have room to move. But if you try to become a complete jellyfish, then you don't develop the tone that's needed in order to organize your system properly. Right? We need to be able to relax, and we need to be able to benefit from waves of stress. So in physical and neurochemical exercise, we see these patterns. We see a similar thing in spirituality, where you need to be able to open and release and transcend, but you also have to be a container or a landing pad in which the benefits of those exercises can find a good, solid container in order to show up in a human life. So that's from that point of view of tone. But where adjacency comes into spiritual practice for me is usually more in terms of either non-duality applied to all of our lives rather than treated as a specific state that you can get into, or to what I've called the integration surplus model, which is a way of thinking about spirituality as a kind of production from among our subjectively active internal systems. And we can analytically break down ourselves in different ways. We could say right brain, left brain. We can say chakras. We can say heart, mind, body. There's a number of different ways to analytically dissect the individual. But when you've done that, you can think of what's normally considered to be the individual self as concealing this plurality of different functional systems. And an improved relationship between these functional systems can generate a level of collaboration that creates something like it's more than the sum of the parts, which can then be lensed as a higher self or a new energy or some kind of imaginal other or something like that. But in order to get this production of extra numinous coherence, is how I would phrase it, you have to do work in the in-between spaces, in the adjacencies between these things that were previously experienced to be just yourself. So where you have these different systems and they're too packed together, they're too entangled, you can't tell them apart, then you don't have the ability to locate them as things that could be in relationship to each other. So then you just have what we would call the ego. When one of these things gets triggered, they all get triggered. If they're too far apart and they have no communication with each other, then there's no potential for them to harmonize in new ways to produce some extra quality. So if you can use practices, exercises, or even your direct experience of consciousness and sensation to negotiate the in-between spaces between these different identified systems that have different qualities, then you can allow them to cooperate in a way that helps them become a better team. And when they function as a better team, it's like people singing in an orchestra. You get an additional effect, and that additional effect is a spiritual effect that can seem to permeate or supersede the field of your perceptual and cognitive options. And insofar as it's produced, you can then enter into a kind of relationship with it that changes the way you generate meaning and the way you navigate through life.
Yeah, it's kind of the effect of harmony, would you say?
That's a very good way to think about it. But that's also, it's important to think about that as the outcome, because one of the ways you might allow these parts to come closer together without getting fully entangled is to allow them to argue. Right? So a lot of the things you see in spiritual exercises throughout history is to embrace suffering, to embrace cognitive dissonance, to embrace internal friction, to let your angel and your devil fight each other. So harmony is the result, but it's not always the process. It's the result of the process.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's an important clarification. And I suppose I can lead in here with the harmony and the conflict that perhaps I perceive. I don't know if you perceive as well, between two giant thinkers. Of course, I'm teaching a course on Hegel's Science of Logic. He's had a particularly important impact on the unfolding of my notion. And Ken Wilber, who I think has had probably a profound impact on the unfolding of your notion and the larger integral community and the meta modern space. When I think about these thinkers, there is a way in which I can immediately make a connection of their similarity in terms of that they're both big thinker philosophers, both big picture philosophers. However, I can also think of their differences in the sense of that they often attract different thinkers. They certainly, the people who are inspired by their work form different types of communities and perhaps are interested in different things or approach perhaps the same thing from a different angle. In your experience and perhaps in your spontaneous ideology, how do you see the relationship between a thinker like Hegel and a thinker like Wilber? Do they have a shared space, and what's their space of difference?
There are ways in which they are similar, and there are ways in which they are different. Obviously, like you say, they're big picture, big history thinkers. They both deal with evolving emergent understanding that attempts to enfold its alternatives and predecessors. They both try to integrate together structures out of conventional opposites. They both suffer the Kierkegaardian accusation of being too top down, too systematic. They're certainly different in terms of their cultural appeal. right? One is European, one is North American. That's already going to draw different sensibilities. One is fairly contemporary in terms of the technological and historical niche. The other is a couple hundred years out of date, but also available to see the emerging modernity. So Hegel has an interesting viewpoint from the beginning of modernity, and Wilber has an interesting viewpoint looking back on modernity. Wilber is more of a popularizer. Hegel is more of a, I don't know, comprehensive intellectual purist in a way. He doesn't make it easy for you. Wilber tries to make some of his stuff marketable, which is a source of admiration and critique. Hegel maybe is more profound. Wilber maybe is more useful for this moment in history. Hegel certainly works better with psychoanalysis, but Wilber maybe works better with Eastern meditation and these schools of developmental psychology. So I think there are obviously some interesting similarities. Wilber would probably postulate that Hegel is very much doing the same kind of thing he's doing, just in a way that's slightly out of date. I think that's unnecessarily marginalizing and diminishes the unique contributions of Hegel to some degree. But it's certainly not foolish to say that they're operating in the same broad terrain of trying to appreciate science and spirit, trying to build evolutionary development and the integration of opposites into the fundamental method of approaching reality, and trying to move forward from modernism into something that reappreciates spirit and produces new kinds of knowledge structures that modernity can't quite get at because of its limitations in terms of how it perceives the opposites of its own knowledge attempts.
I think there's so much I could.
Also, let me just say, Wilber worked out a lot. So Wilber in his prime could take Hegel in a fight.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if Hegel could.
But Wilber now is decrepit and old, so it's hard to say. But I think there was a point where Wilber was pretty buff.
Yeah.
But maybe Hegel.
You look intimidating, actually. Okay. But there's so much good stuff there that I could draw from there, and I really appreciate some of the distinctions you made there, and spontaneously I agree with the way you're seeing this situation. I'm going to choose to focus on the commonalities and the broad terrain. And I think that brought, and that really connects well to the science of logic, because I do think that where they do connect most clearly and most importantly is in this relationship between science and spirit, which I think is so important. And I think that here the relationship is usually situated in terms of a sort of naive scientific objectivity, which leaves out the subject, and a sort of spiritual subjectivism, which takes into consideration our intuitions and our feelings and our emotions, but leaves us without a certain logical objectivity. So I know how Hegel tries to approach this rift, but I actually don't know how Wilber tries to approach this rift. So I'd be interested to know from your perspective how Wilber approaches the rift between science and spirit. I could just say very quickly that as it relates to the science of logic, Hegel is here saying that science itself has forgotten to turn its own gaze onto the very structures of logic which determine the human being, or come to determine the human being. So, what's your view on Wilber's approach to science and spirit?
Yeah, the way Wilber comes at this is from a couple of different directions. I mean, one of the things he's doing is trying to say these are the parts you would need in a meta theory. So AQUIL is a description of the types of vision logic structures, I'd call them metaphemes, that you might need in order to make sense of things. And so each of those would have a different way of approaching it, right? Wilber has a developmental lens. And from the developmental lens, he would think of knowledge and society being similar to a Piagetian set of developmental stages, whereby you have essentially symbolic pre-rational forms of cognition. You develop to have very rational modes of cognition, and then you can develop into trans-rational modes of cognition, which are able to simultaneously cross-fertilize between your magical and intuitive experiences, and you're rational, but also carry the implications of your rational forward to places that might be uncomfortable for the ordinary rationalist to go. So that's how you'd view it through the lens of development. Is there's a movement of stages to the point where people have a cognitive complexity that can hold both rationality, both science and spirit, let's say. There's also a lens of states where Wilber would say there's, like they do in the East, gross, subtle, causal, non-dual, right? So there's certain gross realm, there's certain physical, material-based knowledges, and there's a kind of science you can get about the material. There's another kind of science you can get about the poetic. There's another kind of science you can get about the tautological extremes that you can find as states of consciousness. So there would be these different alternative ways of doing essentially what science is doing, but in different domains that would yield different knowledge sets. And so to be transrational in that sense would be to be capable of acquiring experiential knowledge in domains that include but are not limited to the material. And then there would be this thing that he calls the quadrants. You could use the quadrant lens as well, which tries to say that singular, plural, interior, and exterior are all fundamental dimensions of any arising occasion in the Whiteheadian sense. And so you would need to incorporate shared and subjective experience alongside your objective knowledge in order to flesh out your science, in order to keep it from being reductionistic. Wilber has this notion of flatland, and flatland is essentially modern or postmodern knowledge deprived of the concept of depth, deprived of the integration of subjective and intersubjective experience alongside systemic and objective knowledge. So those are, maybe it runs together for people that aren't that familiar with it, but those are three different ways in which Wilber would approach what I call transrational, which is the integration of the scientific, modern, rational mind with these other knowledge sets.
I mean, the first question I have here is actually, it's a technical question, I suppose, which I do think has far-reaching implications, and it's related to developmentalism. So, you state Wilber is a developmentalist, and in many ways, I think Hegel, actually, not just in many ways. I mean, I could also say Hegel is a developmentalist as well. However, Hegel's developmentalism is very strange, and it's taken me a while to wrap my head around what type of developmentalism he's trying to articulate. And as is often helpful for humans, a metaphorical image is useful. And the metaphorical image that Hegel uses is like the development of an embryo into an adult human, or the development of a seed into a full-blown tree. And the logic here is kind of like that the form of the adult human is not actual in the embryo, but it's implicitly there. And so like the form of the full-blown tree is not actual in the seed of the tree, but it's implicitly there. And so there's this logic that what you develop into is what you, in some sense, already are, or something like that, or the seed potential is already there. So like this has a relevance, perhaps, in the meta-modern sense to the idea of absolute knowing, or the idea that what we potentially develop into, perhaps you could call it transrational cognition of some kind, is kind of has a seed form in the earlier forms of cognition, but it's already there. How do you relate to this way of thinking?
I think we have to assume that the potential for what we become is implicit in what we were. But I think, and this goes to some interpretations of Hegel, that's only known retroactively. And when you know it retroactively, you can't naively presume that it was there before you knew it retroactively. I think there's a lot of, there's only certain ways to solve for thwarts and collisions, right? The structure of reality only allows certain kinds of stabilizations of instabilities to occur. So if you had a developing human being or a developing tree or whatever else it is, it's got these potentials and we don't know what they are, and it's unfolding, and it might run into a problem, and it's going to struggle with that problem. And whichever way the solution goes will be sort of retroactively inscribed as the only way it could have gone, and as the necessary unfolding that redefines what that potential was at the beginning. However, that's not a purely arbitrary process, because there's only a couple of ways it could solve that stalemate condition. And then those ways can be descriptively captured and proposed as sort of unfolding stage-like progressions, as long as we don't get too narrow and ladder-like about how we conceive that. I think we need to, for ourselves going forward, emotionally embrace the sense in which we are becoming the thing we were always destined to be. But analytically, we have to understand that that's to a significant degree added on to our experience of our past by what we have become, and that neither of those inhibit the other one, that we need to somehow go ahead doing both of those, being aware of the radical contingency that retroactively defines the necessity of its past, and poetically believing in the fact that we are fulfilling the essence of what we are.
I think that all I want to say is just that I really like the way you're articulating this relationship between contingency and necessity, and that I think one of the downsides of certain interpretations of Hegel is that you downplay the radical contingency that is at the heart of these processes. And so I think that in my experience of reading, for example, Slavoj Žižek, he does a good job of emphasizing this relationship between contingency and necessity. And for anyone who's interested, I would point in that direction to further unpack that philosophically. But I think we're at least coming to the close of the questions that I wanted to ask. And the final one I wanted to ask was in relationship to the concept of nothing. So the concept of nothing, I actually remember when I was in my sort of scientific materialist days, listening to like pop physicists conversations where they would veer into philosophy, like guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Lawrence Krauss and guys like that. And they had a sort of a physics panel talking about nothing. And they basically said it was a silly philosophical concept. Even Lawrence Krauss said something like philosophers are experts about nothing. In a sort of derisive way. But actually, the concept of nothing features quite heavily in Hegel's Science of Logic. And actually, it's foundational because he says that the entirety of his logic is based on the sort of unity between being and nothing. And that unity of being and nothing ultimately is a becoming. But it's a paradoxical unity, being and nothing. It's not a unity that gives me this sense of like a harmony without conflict. It gives me the sense of a unity which is constantly flipping between paradoxical opposites. And that actually, when he goes into the relationship between being and nothing, I can quite easily apply it to the experience of my own unfolding development. But maybe before I ask the question, what do you think of light question, right? What do you think of the concept of nothing, and how does it come up in your metaphysics of adjacency?
Yeah, I've always been fond of a complaint that Henri Bergson makes in Creative Evolution, that the abstract concept of absence, that nothing is not thinkable, right? Which you can sort of get if you try to think of nothing and observe what it is that you do in that move. This is Bergson's complaint. Or you could try to think of everything and add to it the thought of removing everything. You could try to think of a vast, empty spaciousness, but that's still spaciousness. So all of the things that people do, Bergson is saying that where they think they're thinking of nothing, they're not actually thinking of nothing. And you have to be a little bit more radical with the thought of nothing and say that the thought of nothing not only is the thought of nothingness, but it itself is a non-thought, right? That there is no nothingness, that nothingness is more nothing than you even think it is. It's in fact impossible to think. And when you think you're thinking of it, you're actually thinking of something else. You might be thinking of availability or spaciousness or indeterminacy or something like that, or cancellation. So my fundamental disposition is that when people talk about nothing, they don't actually mean nothing. But you can certainly have relative absences and presences of some kind. You can take a picture of a park bench without me on it. Now, is that a picture of me not on a park bench? Well, relative to a picture of me on a park bench, it is. But in a sense, there's no absence in that picture. That picture is completely full. No absence is actually presented except as a relative contrast. So where does the concept of non-existence come into play? It comes into play as a relative contrast to existence and vice versa. So from the adjacency point of view, there's always some space of negotiation between these concepts, which are essentially the same concept, the same metapheme, right? You find becoming everywhere because you can't find anything that isn't, in a way, oscillating on some gradient between is and is not. It's always in an ish kind of a space. So fundamentally, things seem like they are more relatively or seem like they are less relatively. And neither of those absolutes are ever perfectly attained. It never 100% only is. It never 100% only isn't. In order to deal with anything that's real, we have to be dealing with something that is a functional negotiation between something like a relative absence and something like a relative presence.
Right. And in relationship to that, there's this way in which you articulate this shift of perspective as it relates to nothing. And so I can frame that in relationship to thinking about nothing in an absolute sense, like something's 100% isn't, to more of this gradient of is and is not, where you say nothing matters from a negative valence to a positive valence, where there's this perspectival shift on nothing matters. And what do you mean by this, and how does that show up in your life?
Yeah, I mentioned that in terms of the film Everything Everywhere All at Once, because there's a sense in which, I don't know if you've seen the film, it's quite an absurdist romp through the multiverse. And the villain is the one who's lived through all these different realities and therefore experiences nothing as having any meaning. Nothing matters. But the climax of the film is this person re-encounters through their own personal experience people they have intimate relationships with, and they're transformed into the idea that nothing matters. Right. So nothing matters in that it doesn't matter, or nothing matters in that it actually does matter. It just has that same form that you were pointing to as nothing. And I think that's one of the things that's going on throughout metamodernism. Like metamodernism takes over the structural critiques of the postmodern, but it no longer sees them merely as a critique. It sees them as the building blocks of a new sincerity. So we get this idea of sincere irony in metamodernism. Right? It's not irony as a distancing or limiting factor. It's irony as the empowering factor of a new sincerity. And I think that's where adjacency comes in as well. We used to think, the casual way of thinking and the professional way of thinking, was that sort of and approximately and almost were some unpleasant category, that paradoxes were some unpleasant category, that there was this intermediation space of edges and boundaries and approximations that were somehow failures to provide discrete, useful knowledge. But I think we can look at that and go, you're absolutely right. The fact that there are all these different contexts, different interpretations, different reality pictures, this means that there is some ambiguity about what reality fundamentally is. But that's not a limitation. We can embrace that. We can have a good conscience about that. We can say, in a way, that the sort ofness, that almosts can become the building blocks of our new cathedral, that we aren't stuck with them. We can flip the valence on the same structure and start to build up from it, rather than simply gaze at it as if it were the limiting alternative to knowledge.
I would, on the basis of that description, I would say that the way you're relating to the difference between postmodernism and metamodernism is somewhat analogous to the difference between Kantian's critique, Kant's critique of pure reason, and Hegel's Science of Logic, because in some sense, Kant's critique of pure reason is saying, pure reason is impossible. We're never going to have a purely rational view of the thing in itself, and the thing in itself is going to be forever at a distance from us. We're only going to have approximations. We're only going to have limited knowledge. And Hegel's saying that those approximations, those limits, are the thing in itself. So it's just a perspectival shift on in some sense, the same thing. And so
it incorporates the same structure, but it attributes to it a different meaning, which accompanies a different valence as well.
Right. And I think that that's very useful for thinking about the postmodern condition. I think to me it brings up, and here I'm just trying to connect it to the science of logic, is that it connects to the logic of the negation in the sense that postmodernism, broadly speaking, is let's say trying to represent a condition where nothing matters. And for example, I think the postmodern show par excellence here would be something like Seinfeld, where they're not only a show about nothing, but within the show itself, they're saying, let's make a show about nothing. And they do the negation within the show itself. But it seems like that, as it relates to how you're describing the metamodern sensibility, there is this type of negation where you're, taking this negativity and flipping, offering a minimal perspectival shift on the same situation. Is that correct?
The postmodern, absolutely. The brilliance of the postmodern is its ability to, based on its own experience of shifting between perspectives, to identify the fact that contextual boundaries are not perfectly self-sufficient, right? That in order to figure out what's going on, you always have to step outside of a context into another context that it's negotiating with. And that other context could be a bigger frame. It could be some marginalized thing that wasn't included. It could be the hidden presence of the other and the opposite. Postmodernism is able to locate that, and it tends to mobilize that location as if it was simply a critique. And then we're stuck with the fact that these additional perspectives and the intercontextual space between them is somehow an empty, barren landscape of infinitely receding self-reflections. And that's what it would be if you didn't take one further step back and ask how you could use all of that. You do that kind of thing Hegel does to Kant, which is say, you have to step outside of the boundary in order to accomplish the boundary. That doesn't mean the boundary fails. That means the shape of a functional boundary is the shape of stepping outside of a boundary. That's what a boundary looks like. And once you have that, then you go, oh, great. Now we have these things that we can actually use. They just happen to have this particular shape. Now let's try to rebuild our science. Let's try to rebuild our philosophy. Let's try to rebuild our social and spiritual practice out of things that have this particular shape, if that shape is something we will always uncover when we look at any context or any meaning.
Right. And when we think about shape, I think that in the philosophical sense, we can use the word shape, we can use the word form. And then that sort of brings us back to perhaps the original problem with Plato in terms of thinking the perfect shape or the perfect form. And a lot of this has been trying to think historical form, the historical negotiation of form given multiple subjects. So sort of back to sort of the starting point of our conversation where you say the base of the metaphysics of adjacency is this variable intensity relational space and the shapes and the forms that we sort of negotiate throughout a life process.
This feeds back to our entire conversation because there's a kind of reactive reluctance in people who've grown up reflecting their own emotional insufficiencies through the knowledge of absolutes, where they go, well, you can't have that. You can't have fuzzy boundaries. You can't have things that are dependent. We would fail to be able to use the world if it was negotiable and fuzzy and dependent. And they make that claim. But in the example of making love that we used earlier, it's not the case that you can't get what you want in a sort of space. You absolutely can. You lose what you want in a totally dissociated or totally merged space. The only place you can get what you're after is in a sort of, in a blurring of that boundary, in a step beyond the boundary that still counts as the boundary.
I suppose then well, I have two questions if you don't mind. My first question is that I've seen in our very broadly speaking online space, intellectual space, that there's a deep temptation for a return of fundamentalist religion, orthodox religion, and this temptation of orthodox fundamentalist religion has come up throughout the history of postmodernism. How do you think about that within the context of the metaphysics adjacency? That would be my first question. The appearance of fundamentalist religion, orthodoxy.
Yeah, I think it can go two different ways, right? There's a sort of pre-trans fallacy, to use Wilber's terminology, right? There's a sense in which what we're doing as a contemporary society, and even as very advanced leading edge thought movements, that are insufficient to the experiences needed by a person to live a whole multidimensional life. So if you're not getting those, there is a temptation to regress to a primitive form that you project as having some kind of deeper, more dynamic meaning-making capacity. But you can also move forward into some kind of traditional form, in quotes, right? And a lot of the best people who've occupied any of the seemingly traditional, even mythic religions have actually been fairly reasonable, fairly relaxed people that didn't take it too seriously. Or they took it seriously enough to make it workable, but not so seriously that it shut down their thinking, their heart, or their relationships. So there's a sweet spot in there that we can move forward into. And I think metamodernism, or any attempt to be postmodern, has got to find ways to give people useful patterns in their lives that bring back a lot of those things that human beings are built to go through. And so that will involve a more adjacency, or if it works, it will involve a more adjacency oriented version of any of the inherited patterns, but it doesn't have to. Those are just some of the options. It can also involve spontaneously producing new emergent forms that are more idiosyncratic and more appropriate to the world moment.
I just want to take this moment when you're saying, emphasizing this not taking things too seriously approach, that there's this really useful axiom I've been at least repeating to myself is that this difference between our situation is serious but hopeful, to the idea that our situation is hopeless but not serious. And I like the second approach a little bit more, but or I find it useful anyway. And then I guess the final question I have for you is in relationship to the metamodern space. And so how to frame this would be, the way I've always thought about postmodernism is not so much that it's an ideology where I encounter postmodernists who identify with it, but more the identification of a social condition or the identification of a social symptom. So like, for example, going back to Lyotard's paper, very well-cited paper on grand narratives, he's not sort of saying that people shouldn't construct grand narratives. He's more saying that contemporary subjectivity does not believe in grand narratives in the way that subjectivity might have believed it in the past. You could say he's saying subjects are more complex now, and our environment is more complex now than is sort of conducive to large-scale belief in grand narratives. And when I experience the metamodern community, I see more, I guess the question would be, are you identifying a new social condition, or are you identifying with a worldview or belief system? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and it's an open-ended question, right? If you go among people who think about these things, you'll find them leaning in different directions. I think that it would be very implausible that if we're seeing something start to emerge, that thing isn't being driven by existing social conditions that are emerging, part of which are technological, some of which are media, some of which are just the way that our brains are wired at the moment and the care we have to take now in response to catastrophic possible circumstances. So there's a lot of external variables that are forcing a new kind of response. And that response also sorts between its options. If there's a whole bunch of things we've tried that clearly don't work, then we tend to put those off the table and cluster around the few things that still might have potential. I think of it, though, as having some element of developmental complexity. So in models of developmental hierarchy, one of the things that characterizes them is you're embedded at a level, you're able to see the levels prior to that level of embedding, right? So that a postmodernist, one way to think about them, is responding to changes in the world circumstances, pointing out what the hypermodern agents' lives are like. But another way to think about postmodern is they're able to see and or feel problems inherent in modernity that people who are still embedded in the modern sensibility can't detect. And likewise, you could say that there are problems implicit in postmodernism that can't be detected from within postmodernism. And so there'll be communities of people, some of whom can see and identify, and some of whom simply feel that there's an insufficiency in the postmodern, and therefore they gravitate toward different kinds of models and different kinds of cultural practices.
All right, and I'm tempted for another question, but I'm satisfied with that. I guess my other temptation is what are, and you're probably the perfect person to ask this question to, so I'm going to ask it because, what do you think is there a blind spot of the meta-modern condition? And if so, what do you sense into in that direction? And is it even useful to sense in that direction?
It's worth probing, but I don't know that we can come to any clear answers yet because it's a fairly small percentage of the global population who are sensitive to that. And the idea of trying to make any conclusive statements about what would go beyond that is pretty dubious. However, there are some recurrent patterns of antagonism within the field, and it's uncertain how much those are structural elements and how much they are things that point to something that would go beyond it. I think there tends to be over-reliance on the notion of individual level-like development. There tends to be an exaggerated sense of the differences between, let's say, tribes within the community. I mean, that's one of the things I see a lot. Maybe that's from my particular bias as somebody who finds it relatively easy to incorporate people who are doing different thematic work. But there's a sense in which people think, oh, we're really doing this thing. It's integral, or it's meta-modern, or it's whatever we want to call it. And all those other people who are doing it in a different tone, they just don't get it. They're not really a part of this. Right. So if that over specialization and internal divisiveness, I think might be a sign that it's just beginning and it hasn't really been able to embrace itself as a totality, but it might indicate some unbearable line of tension that will force forth another level of consideration at some point.
I guess I would throw forth the perspective, at least the way I've historically, personally, emotionally related to postmodernism is, again, not as an identity, but more as sort of the recognition of a condition. And also, I like the way you articulated that there are people who are sensitive to that postmodern condition, which may be able to read symptoms in modernity that people in a modern frame can't sense. And I think that there's a lot of utility to sort of being sort of emotionally attuned to that postmodern condition. I guess I would put forward the idea that the way I sort of emotionally, subjectively, and historically relate to the various ideas that could be grouped under metamodernism is, again, not so much a personal identity as sort of an emotional attunement to a historical condition, and what that historical condition might be as different from postmodernism. Does involve sort of a more integrative, does I think involve the logic of the negation, where nothing matters becomes nothing matters. just this perspective.
No, I think of the metamodern sensibility as being an early juvenile stage of something that is both what Hegel and Nietzsche were looking towards, as well as many of the spiritual thinkers. I think it is an adaptation to the world moment. And I think that to imagine beyond that is a useful exercise, but the next world moment is likely to be so much different than anything in human history that we can't really speculate too clearly about that, right? So if metamodernism is just starting, and let's say it goes for 50 years or 100 years, on the other side of that, what does human even mean, right?
Yeah,
We're brain machine
I
interface,
agree.
we're breeding new species. So what there is something next, but the something next at the moment stands for us is just the threshold of utter strangeness.
I agree, and just to give a little plug for Philosophy Portal, the first anthology we created has the title "Enter the Alien," and for me, like the signifier alien has had an increasingly important role in my cognition. Just has spontaneously become more important, and I'm not thinking about alien in the scientific materialist sense of a actual intelligent organism out there. I'm also not thinking about alienation in the Marxist sense that we are sort of separate from our essential substance that we need to reappropriate through our work energy or something like that. I'm thinking about the alien as like the way you're saying that there's some way in which we're confronting a fundamental otherness to what we think of as our current identity. And that there are many perhaps symptomal formations in our current horizon, like I would say two interesting ones being the appearance of transhumanist communities and the appearance of transgender sort of activism as two examples of something that points beyond fundamental categories of our current identity. But anyway,
Yeah, there's a limiting condition to adjacency. So when we start to think about going beyond and going in trans and opening up these spaces that are between and beyond, there's a threshold of intensity that becomes utterly opaque to us, which is similar to what happens in supreme non-dual states. Is the opposites are so close together you can't tell them apart, and it becomes a limit on what could be said or known in the conventional sense. I had a conversation with Sean Hargens, who's sort of the integral guy who specializes in extraterrestrial studies and multidimensional entities and things like that. And as part of that discussion, I said, well, imagine Wilbur's map on a carpet laid out. It's the great ontology, has all the different kinds of experience. Under that carpet is a mouse, and it just moves around. It's just a bump that operates irrespective of our ontological categories. There's a fundamental disruption of even the best kind of mapping that we could make. And metamodern and adjacency theories can make a space for that, but at some point that's too intense and becomes utterly alien.
The bump as such.
Bump as such.
No longer is it the bump in your map, but it's the bump as such. Anyway, I'll leave some space here. So I'm really enjoyed this conversation, and I think that there was many points in this conversation where we were able to make some interesting connection between your work with the metaphysics of adjacency and what I hope to achieve in trying to teach the science of logic. And again, if you're interested in learning more about that, there'll be links in the description. And the course, if you're still listening, the course will start January 16th. Last day to sign up is January 15th. So again, link in the description for that. And thank you so much for coming on to have this conversation. I think there are very few people who I could have this conversation with, and I'm very grateful that I'm able to have it with someone like you. So I guess the last thing I'll ask is if you have any final thoughts or final reflections on the conversation. Go for it.
Well, only two things. I really enjoyed this conversation. I like hanging out with you, and I'll be trying to make some of the connections with Hegel more explicit when we do the course material. But one of the things when we talked about spirituality and we talked about tradition that we didn't really touch on is God. And I think there's an interesting way in which I hold God in quotation marks to be more profound than God without quotation marks. That valence shift we talked about in going from nothing matters to nothing matters can also be done with the kind of typical postmodern move of putting a logically ironic syntax around something. So that God shouldn't be taken as a diminution of its profundity, but an amplification. So one of the basic moves suggested by the metaphysics of adjacency is that quotation marks should be taken as amplifiers of value and meaning. It's the same move, but the valence is the opposite. This is the way forward, is to put everything, including the absolute, in quotes.
All right. It's a nice way to think about it, and a nice thought to leave our viewers with. So thanks a lot, Layman. And again, links in the description to both some of the papers we talked about as it related to the metaphysics of adjacency and more information about the Science of Logic course. So with that, I will end off.